Hello everyone. Thanks again for the lovely JNS Youth for having me for this TEDx talk. My name is Kiran Bhat. I'm an Indian-American polyglot, novelist and poet. And I'm here to talk today about what it means to think beyond the boundary of the border. The Oxford Dictionary defines the border in the following way. First, a border is a line demarcating two nations, political entities, or administrative divisions. Normally, when we think of a border, we think of the border, say, between India and Pakistan, or Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. We think of two separate political identities. On one side is this space, on the other side is that space. The Oxford Dictionary also defines a border in the following way. A border is a boundary or edge around something. Without us ever thinking about it, we're always creating borders and all the time. We're thinking about the border between this chair and the floor, between the tree and the air, between the grass and the building, between my physical body and the outside world. We are creating borders because it's also necessary for our human survival. As little children, as little babies, you see little boys hitting themselves with their toys, hitting themselves with their pudding or whatever they're eating. That's because they're physically not able to understand, this is me and this is the outside. They're learning that by hitting themselves with their objects or trying to put things in their mouth or in their nose. We also see little children yell and shout, this is mine, every time a person even comes close to their favorite toy. That is because they're creating identity. They're creating an idea of this is what belongs to me. This is what I identify with. This is not what another person can have. This only belongs to me. Even though we create borders for our survival, we also create borders with ego and with identity. We put ourselves first and foremost as the existence of this world because that is what we're born and brought up with. We see ourselves first and foremost with these eyes, after all. But then we slowly start to create a bigger world around that. We start to say, this is what I have. This is what this other person cannot have. This is my ethnic identity. I'm a Hindu person. I'm not this type of person. I'm male or female. I'm not this type of person. And we start to create borders around people based on what they are and what they aren't. What we identify with and what others happen to be. Again, this is a very natural and normal thing. We do it for survival as well. We grew up many, many thousands of years ago in tribes, and we had to forage for food in small communities, and we had to make sure that whatever our community had could remain there. Otherwise, the people we loved could be violated by outsiders, taken by outsiders, or resources could be taken. And so there was that fear that anyone who's outside of this line could take what belongs to us. So a lot of these things come from a natural place, but sometimes the consequences of these things lead to exclusion, discrimination, and treating people as different because of how we identify ourselves and how others identify themselves. I'm someone who is made aware of the fact that people create these boundaries and borders from an extremely early age. I grew up in the United States to a family who immigrated from southern India. And the way that the US was in the 90s and 2000s when I started living there was a little different. People had this idea, you had to speak in a certain way, you had to vote in a certain way, you had to believe in certain things. And if you were not able to do that, you could be excluded or treated as different. Conversely, my parents grew up with a very particular culture that was different as well. They had a certain idea of how we should speak, how we should behave, how people should interact. And while they wouldn't exclude me because I'm their son, there was still this idea that if I do not fall into a certain parameter of how people behave, I could also risk being excluded by other people. These were often things that were contradictory. What some Americans would teach and what Indians would teach would usually be completely different. Let me give some examples. For example, in Indian culture, when one eats, one is supposed to finish the entire plate, no matter how full or hungry you are. You cannot waste food. In American culture, we had a family that helped take care of my parents were very busy with their practice, and there would be a family that would take care of me after school who happened to be Polish background and American background. And they would tell me, okay, Kiran, if you're full, just finish up to the amount you're finished and then leave the rest. You know, just finish up to here, put your plate to the side, politely say I'm full, and then the rest can be chucked in the waste bin. So it's a completely different idea of how we should eat. Conversely, that same couple. So again, in Indian culture, people do not give personal space. You know, people tend to cling and crunch themselves together, even if there is space. Americans, on the other hand, stand apart. So for example, I was on that swing with that same older gentleman, and I was a little boy, I was like 5 or 6, and I was crouching into him on the swing. It was one of these wooden swings. And he pushed me a little to the side and said, you have to create this amount of space between yourself and me. Because I was violating his sense of personal space. He had to have this amount of space between himself and myself, and that would be proper conduct or norm. So again, what often my family would teach and what the outside society would teach would not only be completely different, but contradictory, which resulted in what a lot of ABCDs also called confusion. Because you're taught two completely different things that are actually completely different. So for some people that causes lifelong confusion, and it naturally would. But for me, it also taught me an interesting paradox. That for what one society says, this is everything that belongs and this is everything that does not belong, another society will look at that same thing and say, this is everything that does belong and that's everything that doesn't belong. And that's a paradox. Because one type of human is looking at this and giving it all this value, but another person of another background is looking at all this and giving it a completely different value. So I realized innately that these things were contradictory. Another thing made me realize that I was innately different. I happened to be gay. Now, in the 90s, 2000s, being an LGBTQI person in any part of the world was really difficult, especially in the US South, but any part of the world, 90s, 2000s was not the best time to be a sexual minority. But I think I subliminally realized that whatever I was, whatever I felt, was not in the norm of how men should behave, and that I would face exclusion from the idea of what manhood or masculinity could be because of the idea of what sexual orientation ought to mean. So there were two sorts of things that made me realize that based on something that was out of my control, out of what I just happened to be, I would be put outside of the border. And I would always be seen as the person that people would exclude, harass, make fun of, outside of my control because I just happened to be in the spot where other people would not want me to be. I started traveling, you know, I'm very grateful. I left Georgia in the 90s, 2000s. I left, I traveled, and I went to Spain. I realized also again in Spain, everything I was taught from say a South Indian background or an American background was useless, again, useless. Everything that the Spanish believed in was also again completely different from what these people believed in. And I had this realization, I want to write, I want to travel, I want to live all over the world. I want to write, you know, assuming that none of these things had to matter, that I could create novels or poems or stories that spoke to a global condition, that spoke to any human of any origin or any way of thinking, no matter how they identified on this planet. So I knew that in order to create these books, I had to travel, I had to live in different countries. Being what I was not enough. I did not know enough about other cultures, other communities. So I started traveling. I spent a year in Europe. Then I got a job teaching online. I went and did a year in Latin America. I did a year in Southeastern Asia. I did a year in Eastern Africa. I did a year in Istanbul, a year in Shanghai. So many different places I went. And in each place, I sort of realized that every single place had a different way of creating their border, their way of seeing the world, their identities, their cultures, their languages. And what seemed like, maybe when I was born and brought up as a binary, it was either this or that, became an infinitude. There's actually thousands upon thousands of ways that people are creating borders, probably billions, because there's 7 billion of us on this planet. So there are probably 7 billion borders and disborders that people are creating every day, all the time. And I realized, why do I have to fit into any of them? You know, if this person believes this way is the right way, that person believes that way is the right way, why even make an attempt? Why even waste my time? So I started just letting myself learn from everywhere. When I was in China, I'd learn Chinese. I'd learn some of the things Chinese people would do. When I would be in South Africa, I would learn a little bit of their accents or ways of saying things. I let myself be open to all of it. I did not say this is mine, this is not mine. I just let everything enter into me and let myself be in conversation with everything. And so as a result, I ended up picking up a lot of different languages, ended up living all over the world, and I ended up making a lot of international connections that I still talk to this day. I learned that I don't have to be what I was born and brought up as. I can just be an existence, connecting to all of the other existences in this universe. I can learn anything and everything that will allow me to be in conversation with any form that happens to exist in the shapes that we see before us. Now, it would be almost impossible for me to give physical advice, like practical tips how to become a person who thinks outside the boundary of the border. I have learned to think this way because I've lived my life, I've traveled, I've chosen to live outside my comfort zone, I've chosen to deal with people who are very different from me. I've made choices that have allowed me to become this person. And for any of you who are interested in perhaps, maybe some of you would not, maybe some of you are happy living in the boundary of the culture, the space you were born and brought up in, and that gives you comfort or identity or belonging, and that's fine. But for any of you who might want to consider becoming bigger than the lines that the world have drawn for you, I cannot just sit here or stand here and tell you this is how to do it. You have to live your life, you have to learn from others, you have to travel, you have to interact with other human beings, you have to be in conversation with this universe. But I will tell you that I feel like there are a lot of benefits in becoming what I'm attempting to be. One is that I feel connected, interconnected with people who I normally probably would not interact with. I am someone who is friends with my sabjiwala, with my chaiwala, with the person who cleans my house, with probably some of the people of a similar background here in Juhu or Bandra, with a diplomat in Russia, with a random backpacker coming from Slovenia. I can be connected to anyone that I so choose to connect with. And I like also being able to connect not just with other human beings, but also other existences. I can learn interesting things in my YouTube videos about how to better communicate with cats. I can learn interesting facts about algebra or calculus that can help me maybe communicate with symbolic ideas and notions of the universe. I can be in conversation with all existence, all essence, all identity, all at once. I don't have to demarcate myself. When I do choose my identities, I choose so with passion and love. I do identify as a Kannadiga because Kannada is my mother tongue and I like speaking my mother tongue. I like being in a position where I am in conversation with my ancestors or my forefathers have given through my mother tongue. I don't choose to speak in it because I think I'm better than someone who speaks Gujarati or Marathi or Urdu or whatever. I am choosing to be in the line of whatever my ancestors chose to give me. Conversely, I happen to love being gay. I love being an LGBTQI person. I love connecting with people of other LGBTQI experiences. And again, I would never say because I'm this way, I'm better than that person or this person. I would want to be inclusive to any person of different ways of seeing the world to make them feel included and a part of the conversations that are happening in front of us. I choose my identities not because I want to say I'm better than someone or I want to perform an identity, but because I believe they give me wisdom and strength and something to anchor myself onto this world. And finally, I am able to learn. I think part of the reason why I speak so many languages and I'm fairly able to get along with anyone is because I don't just perform what I think will help me to look better in front of a certain community or society or background. I try just to learn things because I believe they'll help me get in better touch with anyone or anything. And so I personally believe that this has allowed me to learn the languages I've learned, be more able to access information, because I might find an interesting proverb in Chinese or Turkish interesting, but I won't just learn an interesting proverb to make myself look good in Hindi or Kannada or something. I'll learn because I actually want to learn. So these are all different things that I personally feel have benefited me by choosing to live outside the boundary of the border. And again, I don't think I can give any advice because it's a lived experience, but I really hope that all of you someday will consider the benefits of living in this untethered and infinite universe that happens to exist in this world outside the boundaries of the border. Thank you so much for your attention.